Okay, good afternoon and welcome. Oh, okay, I'm Cheah from USC Ungku Aziz Center. Okay, today we have opportunity to invite Miss Beatrice, okay, from PwC. Okay, today she's sharing about some of the effort that have been done in China, okay, in terms of poverty eradication. Okay, so now we are wasting the time. I pass the floor to Miss Beatrice. Okay, welcome, Miss. The floor is yours.
Hello. Okay. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Beatrice. From PwC. So I'm like UM kindly invited me to do this sharing on poverty eradication in China. So just to also know how this whole thing came about is that I was working with the Chinese government for a bit on different subjects, meaning on climate sustainability, as well as urban, rural, regional kind of development. And that is where I've learned quite a bit on poverty eradication, because that was on the top of the state's agenda at the time. So right now we'll just look into just sharing of what I have learned from like talking to people also through the work there. And so would like to hear your feedback and also questions. You can write that on the chat, and happy to go through that. So what is so impressive about it? Because if let's say we look at China as such a vast country, and what they have managed to declare, which is in 2021 that they have eradicated absolute poverty. And I think you might know that when we talk about SDG goals, it is also to talk about eradicating absolute poverty by 2030. And so China is such a, essentially it is the largest country on earth, right? And yet they managed to achieve that. So we can see how the process of the progress according to the different definitions of poverty line. So even when we look at the definitions of poverty line by the World Bank standard or by China National Poverty Line standard, you can see that essentially there's a drastic reduction in terms of like their absolute poverty. So how it started, so around 1988, it was that time that it had started to talk more there was more focus on, let's say, rural development, poverty, addressing poverty, and things like that. So as of 2012, as we can see here, there's still about 98 million households living in poverty. So it is about 1/9 of the world's poor, which is quite significant if you think about it. And the way they have defined poverty or absolute poverty would be like villages with no electricity access, no road access, and the type of home that they are living as well, which is non-bricks home. So we are talking about potentially some indigenous people still living in caves or living in those houses that are built by mud. So things like that. So around 2012, they have sort of like re-strategized on what exactly poverty is. So there was an adjustment of the poverty line based on the 2010 price index. So what they mean is that they have also redefined what poverty is. So aside from just looking at how much income does a person or does a household earn, we are talking about more things. Like if you understand Mandarin, it's more like 衣食住行. So it's like my clothes, whether I have a house, how do I transport, whether I have access to medical care. So later we can talk more about what are the 2 no worries and 3 no guarantees. So the 3 guarantees, in fact, not 3 no guarantees, 3 guarantees that they have. So that is a very concerted effort actually under the leadership of President Xi Jinping to achieve eradicate absolute poverty around 2020, 2021. So you can see that how the whole of country mobilize their resources into eradicating poverty. So as we can see here in the map, so you can see which are the counties. So as you might know, China is also allocated according to the province. So from province, which is in Malaysia's context is state government. So within province, then they go one level down to local government as well as the counties also. Which is quite similar to Malaysia, but Malaysia has less hierarchy compared to them. So one can see which are the regions with more impoverished counties. So of course, more towards the western side or even central as well. The eastern side where Beijing, Shanghai, the famous Suzhou or even Guangzhou, these areas, they are the so-called richer provinces because they are also along the coastline. So this is how this is where we can see where are the disparity, and you can see the resources that have been put into, let's say, eradicating poverty. Let's say just between 2018 to 2020, we are talking about 47 billion ringgit into these areas. So in the number of impoverished counties, you can see the drastic reduction, especially in 2016 onwards. So why is it that 2016 all the way to 2020, the reduction has changed so drastically and significantly? It is that it is in the past, it was more like blanket poverty reduction. But in 2016, they have introduced a policy which is called the precision and targeted poverty reduction, which means that I will have a poverty reduction package or strategy at the household level. So even though in such a vast country, we are talking about household level type of strategies, which the public officers, which is the government, they would have to develop such kind of policies, and they are also held accountable. And we are talking about that. There's quite a lot, 832 counties with 12,800 villages. So that is where the status quo is. So how did they do that, right? You might ask. It is that there are two-pronged, I would say. The first one is that at the basic, of course, economic transformation would have to happen. Economic development, economic growth would have to happen to lift the entire country up. So we are talking about creating new economic opportunities for the general population, of course, for the poor as well, and to raise general income. So these are the four areas that they are looking at under this broad economic transformation. So the first one is, of course, agricultural productivity, because a lot of these areas are also rural areas or agriculture-based area. We are talking about industrialization. It is not a transformation immediately, but also incremental. So I suppose for some of you who has been to China, you would be able to notice like certain area like Foshan, for example, they are quite specific in, let's say, furniture manufacturing. Certain areas, they are very more focused in textile industry. So there are some kind of like broad economic interventions or economic growth for that region or for that province in order to uplift that economy. The third one is more on managing urbanization as well as urban-rural migration integration. So this is quite critical, which I'll talk about more in the later part of the presentation as well. And why is this important is that I suppose some of you might know they have this hukou system. So which means that it is a bit like our IC, but our IC allows us to live anywhere in Malaysia. So maybe at most is that some West Malaysian without Sarawak registration or Sarawakian registration, you are not allowed to live in Sarawak. You will need to apply for through the immigration, right, to stay in Sabah or Sarawak. So it is something like that, but it is a stricter one. So if let's say my hukou or my IC household registration is based in Beijing, I'm entitled to the benefits as a Beijing citizen to, let's say, healthcare access, to education, to even my pensions kind of system. So of course, more people would want to go to the big cities, right? So how can we manage the kind of urban-rural migration as well as managing urbanization as well? So that is also a core part of their economic transformation process. And the final one, of course, is infrastructure. So road development, rail infrastructure. So China is one of the most developed rail infrastructure in the world in terms of like the extensiveness, even in several parts of central as well as rural China, because they believe that rail, our access would be the key to uplift and unlock economic opportunity. Yeah, so that is the whole economic transformation. And then moving towards poverty alleviation strategy, it is looking at the geography at the start, and then like I said, in 2016 onwards, they look at it from a precision point of view. So it is by household even. So the goal is that what is the goal? How do you define that someone is out of poverty or someone is still in poverty? So the goal is that there are two no worries, which means you should not have worry about food, clothing as well. So these are the two basic essentials for any individual. And there are three guarantees also. So which means that we are talking about compulsory education for children. We're talking about basic healthcare, even from children all the way to the elderly, as well as housing. So everyone must have a decent house that is not that is made out of brick. So these are the three guarantees that that the government wants to achieve in order to consider that someone is not living in poverty. So which means that what we are looking at is not so much of, let's say, just looking at what is the household income, which is more absolute poverty, but also looking at relative poverty. So which means looking into more of other indicators of poverty aside from just looking strictly at the income level, because income can only tell a picture. So when we talk about poverty elevation strategy, which is the part on the right, so there are three broad strategies that we are looking at. So the first one is more area-based poverty elevation strategies. So all the provinces, they would have to have their own poverty elevation strategy as well as their policy. And then, of course, the social protection policies, making sure that access to healthcare education is there, and also making sure that yeah, like the one that I mentioned, the Hukou system is also well managed as well. And the most important part is more on targeted poverty elevation strategy up to the household level. So you can see that in such a big country with different systems, what is very important is to have a strong governance mechanism in order to make sure and ensure that this is realized at the ground. Because a lot of times, even in Malaysia, sometimes we talk about we have beautiful policies, but how can we implement that? I think that is the key, even in unlocking the opportunities in poverty elevation as well. So that's where they are looking at. So we can see how the strategy has evolved over the 4 phases, moving towards a more granular approach. So at the start, it was more relief type. So which means that I give you cash and then that would help you. So it's a bit more towards relieving. And that is still important till today, because in a case where, let's say, someone's house is impacted by disaster, yeah, like by a flood, everything is wiped out. The immediate need of that person is not to find a job or to build a house. The immediate need of that person might be, how do I survive for that day or the next day? So relief type is still important. I wouldn't say that it's not important at all. But of course, what we always say that we are not supposed to teach. We should teach a person how to fish and not just giving them a fish, right? So that is how it has changed over time. So in the 80s, so it is more towards development oriented. So that is where I talk about the left part, which is the economic transformation. What are the infrastructure that is needed? Primary education and monitoring systems for local governments, because a lot of this, it goes on the ground as well. So that is where our local governments will need to take an active role, and they also look into ensuring that they work instead of just relying on government subsidies or handouts. So at this level, it is more focused on counties. And then around 2007, we are looking at more of like development oriented, as well as looking into social security reforms already. So there's a minimum income guarantee, and then they are looking at a multidimensional type of poverty. So looking into village level. So you can see that how it has grown over time. It is in terms of like from national government to provincial to county and then to village level. So at this level, there's already like a T-Bao program. So what is a T-Bao program is that this is the minimum criteria that I would safeguard for you to have a good quality of life. And that the T-Bao program would sort of like change according to county as well as according to village, because goods and services, let's say in parts of Western China, would be less expensive than Eastern China, for example, which is more developed. So we're talking about, let's say, some areas with urban poor. So the DIPA would sort of like change, right, according to areas. And in 2013, that is where the drastic improvement of or reduction of poor people happen. So that is where we talk about more targeted poverty. So at this level, it is already up to a household level and individual level. So at each household level, they would already have looking into a universal medical insurance as well as looking at pension, because there would also be elderly as well. So they have moved on from an area broad-based approach to household approach over time. So how do they do that? Because this is quite a huge effort. So poverty management, you can also say that I can be out of poverty today, but maybe tomorrow something happened in my family, my parents fall sick, and I can fall back into the poverty line, right? So it is really managing that, and also to make sure that the poverty elevation is also sustained over time. So how it is done, especially when we talk about precision up to household level, is that it is really to identify first who are the poor at the area, at the county. So which means that the village head or even the village head would have to go house by house to the villages to identify and to understand the conditions of the families. It's really like a stock taking kind of process. Who are they? What caused them to be poor? How can they exit? And also, how do you avoid recurrence of poverty? So, so if let's say what caused them to be poor is that, for example, the household does not have sufficient income, the children would have to work as well at the farm in order to sustain that kind of family income. So which means we are talking about generational poverty. So the kind of package that would elevate or support that household is that the children will still have to go to school, but how can we still sustain the family in terms of like the daily food, if let's say medical supplies are needed. So this is where they're looking at. That is more household. Let's say we are talking about a village. That village does not have sufficient water resources, yeah, so they would have to spend time, let's say, go to another village to go and draw water or things like that. So that is where basic infrastructure supplies would have to be introduced. So that is another level of interventions. So identifying what caused them to be poor as a village or even as a household would be really critical. And then that is where the precision or targeted way of elevating poverty would be important in through this broadly would be these 8 areas, yeah. Industrial development, what kind of industries can be introduced in that area? How can we ensure there will be quality employment? We talk about also relocation and resettlement as well. So of course, sometimes you might also read from the news that the entire village would have to be relocated to a slightly more urban area, because no matter what it is, they're living in the mountains or in the, somewhere that's so rural that it does not make any financial economic sense to unlock that kind of infrastructure. So it might be easier for them to relocate and resettle or to integrate them back to the society in that sense. It is also quite debatable whether it is good to do that or not. So I would not, paint a rosy picture that everything is good. It is also quite debatable about culture, things like that. Ecological protection as well as compensation, because a lot of times also because of mismanagement of our land resources or even floods and disaster have caused many people to be poor because they lose their house or fall back into poverty line. So that is actually a big part of their strategy as well. Do they have sufficient crops for that year, or can we make sure that they can be sustained over time? So we are talking about sustainable agriculture. So technological support is also a big part. Later we can talk about how technology or digitalization has also supported the governance mechanism. Education, I think we all know that education plays a big part of Chinese society. So making sure that the children would go to school and making sure that the family is supported enough that the children would be able to go to school. To a certain extent, financial support is needed or is given to the village level, as well as, of course, health support, making sure that there's sufficient health infrastructure in that area. So broadly, I would say that these are the targeted ways to achieve that. Then we can see just a case study here, an example of how Yunnan Yongsheng County has introduced targeted poverty alleviation strategy. So back then, we are looking at about 16,000 households, and how did they manage to leave about 15,000 households out of poverty within this period? So we are talking about reducing it to less than 1%, and that is quite an impressive feat, I would say. So these are the different aspects that has been introduced. So looking into industry, employment, relocation as well, education. So what is important or what is interesting here is that especially towards the deadline, which is in 2020, you would really be able to see local governments going on the ground, literally meeting their KPIs and pushing themselves to create a kind of infrastructure. It is a very difficult process because they would mobilize the local officials to go house by house, village by village every single day to make sure that the target is met, and how can they also make sure that the KPIs are met also. There is also another form of accountability system, which we can talk about later at the governance level. So you can see even in one county, the amount of resources that is needed in order to revitalize the area or to build the kind of infrastructure is actually quite significant. So we are talking about 1 billion Chinese yuan. There's also quite a bit of water conservation projects that has been introduced as well. So what we see here is that it is not just one strategy, but it's quite an integrated way for that county and eventually for the households as well. Then next that is important is to talk about urbanization and also the role of urbanization in poverty alleviation. So how China has also shifted their policies over time is this. In the past, especially after the open up of China, after they have been focused more about urbanization. When we talk about urbanization in English, it is just urbanization, right? But in Mandarin, there are more nuances to it. So the policy was in the past 城市化, which literally just means urbanization. But over time, they have also introduced 城镇化, which actually what it means is urban-rural integrated development. So what are the differences is that on the left, we are talking about the policies was more urban bias policies. So you can see right now today, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, these are the obvious growth epicenter, and more people are drawn to living in urban areas as well. There are also new villages that has been created, but the resources that has been introduced is not as much as compared to these 4 areas. So those days, what it has resulted is more urban-rural disparity or a bit of inequality. Okay, arguably to some extent it still persists today, but the kind of interventions that has been introduced has sort of like is more intended towards balancing that kind of growth as well. So around 2005, which is the 11th five-year plan, the equivalent of our RMK, Rancangan Malaysia, pertama or kedua, that kind of thing, has introduced urban-rural integrated development, so 城镇化 in that sense. So what it means that we are not just focusing resources on these key epicenters, but we want to make sure that across the country, across China, there are also central townships as well as urban districts within a county. And each of the townships as well as each of the districts, there would be basic facilities as well as infrastructure that would be introduced and would be made available. So it's not just the availability, but also the quality. So talking about quality healthcare, quality education. So this is no longer focused on the key metropolitan cities, but across China. So this can also be seen, let's say, for example, one of the region that was demarcated a couple of years ago was Chongqing, Chengdu. So making sure that it is an epicenter of growth of this metropolitan area, more integrated in terms of infrastructure as well as economic structure. So you can see over time how it has also evolved in terms of urbanization. And then right now, where most of the policies document when we see is more like I said, it is more focused to integrated development. And in 2018, so what they have also introduced is rural revitalization. And why is that quite significant is that around 2018, they already noticed that they have already achieved significant improvement in terms of poverty eradication. It was the last mile, and in order to achieve that last mile, they recognized that rural villages needs to be revitalized. So the kind of concept about rural being, left behind should not be there. So this is where rural revitalization kind of policy has been introduced. And then towards the right side, which is 2019, so that was even more about integrated development. So when I say integrated in English, in Mandarin, there are more nuances as well. It's the Ronghe. So it's such an integrated system in terms of governance as well as even policy structure. So there's also a lot more revamp in terms of the whole ecosystem as well. So over time, you can see how the aim of how rural revitalization or rural development kind of strategy has also developed over time. So in around the 2000s, early 2000s, we're talking about things like addressing the issues of rural villages, the villages, as well as the agriculture. Until today, yes, they still talk about the three rural issues, we call that, but it moved away from just raising farmers' income. Right now, it is also talking about quality of life in these rural areas and also enhancing different types of adjacent in the economic industries as well, like ecotourism or very specific cultural type of elements in that rural area also. So digitalization and also modernization is also quite significant in this process as well. So we can see just a very simple one, logistics system. Logistics system as a whole, of course, in big urban areas, in urban cities, metropolitan, it is not an issue. But the transport policy that they have, or transport, passenger transport as well as logistics transport policy that they have is all the way to a rural area, which means that within one day, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's still within one day, so 24 hours, I can get my goods from A to B, no matter how rural it is, within that 24 hours. So the whole entire kind of like transportation system or infrastructure is planned towards that kind of goal, to make sure that integration of the urban and rural area is safeguarded in that sense. So until today, you can see that policies have also been introduced. And the way China introduced new policies is quite common, that they start with pilot cities. So around this area, when they are talking about urban-rural integrated development, there are many pilot cities to implement that and to see how reforms can be made, and very strict KPIs as well. So there are also reforms in rural land systems. I would say that this is quite a complex area that I'm also not an expert in, because there are so much like nuances in the Chinese society as well. But it's also ready to talk about farmers' rights in that sense. So just talking about China, Zhejiang's rural revitalization strategies, which still consists until today. So around 2002, 2001, in the past, they had this poverty eradication unit within the President's Department. They have changed it to the Rural Revitalization Unit because Bureau, sorry, because they do not need. They have already achieved zero absolute poverty. So right now it is to sustain that. So the strategy has changed, hence Bureau has changed. So once it was introduced as rural revitalization, Zhejiang is one of the pilot to talk about that. So they have also introduced the rural revitalization strategies to 3 upgrades. Yeah. So talking about internet. So talking about how to also upskill the rural people to use e-commerce so that they will be able to market their product and produce, not just within Zhejiang, but throughout the country. So that is where the whole integrated system is very important. So on the one hand, the provincial area or even local areas, they will upskill people to put their products onto the e-commerce platform. On the other hand, as in terms of infrastructure, the kind of transport policies is also needed to make sure that the infrastructure is connected enough. So that's why infrastructure is quite an important part of rural revitalization as well. Then after that, they also talk about beautiful villages. So what happened was that I think you might have also read the news about how China has also demolished in the past, I think for the chase of modernization, they perceive some of the rural areas or like the traditional areas as ugly. So right now, under the Meili Xiangcun, the beautiful villages, it is to also encourage local authorities to retain the essence and history and the beauty of the area. So, and also to make sure that the area or the village is also clean as well. So there's a lot of modernization happening, yet preserving the local culture. The downside of this is that because it is also quite focused on some of the KPIs that they have to achieve. So some of the voices from the ground is that I create a quite hipster kind of like area with nice cafes and stuff like that. Is that really revitalization? The kind of discussion or debate is also there. But essentially, the target or the outcomes are still quite clear. It is to really sustain livelihood among the rural communities as well. So Taizhou City also is one of the pilot for China's rural revitalization strategy. So when we look at Taizhou City, we can see it is very important. At the core of it all is spatial planning. So this is where I was sort of like involved with some of the urban planners in Germany, where we look at how territorial spatial planning is important. So what does that mean, right? So land can be categorized two ways, right? You can distinct a land through administrative boundary. For example, it's very clear where Selangor boundary is and where the neighboring Negeri Sembilan boundary is, because that is an administrative boundary. But certain ecosystem or certain area, the reality on the ground is that it can also be influenced by environmental factors. So planning not just in the sense of administrative boundaries, but territorial boundaries as well. So looking at how urban and rural areas can be more integrated in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the systems, or in terms of like the environmental kind of features as well, or even the local cultural elements. So this is where soft planning is also quite important. So at the time, it was also quite focused towards shared prosperity. I think at the time when they were, I think it was in 2018 to 2020, shared prosperity was one of the main focus. So talking about how to integrate different kind of ecological elements into villages, agriculture, the service sector, new economy, as well as carbon. That's where we talk about more climate change related ones. So rural revitalization strategy was really thought through and transformed in the sense of how people can live and also how people can work as well. So this is also pretty interesting in how Zhejiang has done it. So this is just a bit of what we have done as part of the study previously. I think the study is still ongoing, but I've left and returned back to Malaysia. So how urban-rural integration is can be studied and can be seen from a broader level all the way to the village level as well. And so, for example, just giving an example of, let's say we hear a lot about circular economy these days, climate change, things like that. But how does that impact or implicate the villages on the ground? So, so what it really means is that, let's say, in a suburban area, I would provide food towards in the villages, right? With the villages is where the farmers are, and they provide food to the suburban areas. But suburban areas, they might be processing it and go with and it gets transported back to the villages again. So these are the dynamics that we can see. And so how can circular economy, if let's say it is being introduced in the agricultural system, it would have to take into account the the spatial component of the villages as well as the suburban areas also. So that is where it was really interesting. So you can see then how then we look back at the impact over time. So around here, like I said, precision household was introduced, and then they have sort of like eradicated poverty. So these are some of the stats that they have achieved, which I thought is actually pretty impressive for such a vast country. We talk about 94% of children have completed 9 years of compulsory school education. Almost 100% of basic medical insurance coverage. Safe drinking water has increased to 85% in 2020. Safe households that have also been introduced to about 10 million households. When I talk about safe housing, it's like, yeah, like I said, some of them live in caves, some of them live in huts that are made of muds, pretty unsanitary or exposed to flooding and disaster, or even drought to that extent. And also like highways as well as digital connectivity is also achieved throughout this. So they have actually, so which means that altogether, China has lifted about 800 million people out of poverty within 40 years, achieving SDG 1, 10 years ahead of the schedule. I think you might be familiar with Sustainable Development Goals. Number 1, it is to achieve no poverty. But so far, I'm not aware of any countries that have achieved that, but maybe you can share with me as well in the chat or later during the discussion if you are aware of any. So that is where they have actually achieved quite an impressive feat in that sense. So governance is actually really, really important through it all. So how do you really incentivize people to mobilize the public officials to go house to house to provide the kind of incentives? So how do they measure success? Yeah. So number 1 is that the officers or the local authorities that are accountable or responsible to this, they are held accountable through performance measurement as well. So we talk about each of the household, they would need to be very good at identifying individuals who are under poverty line. Because in Chinese society, sometimes you talk about the face, right? Means in that sense, I'm living in poverty, but I do not want to admit because of like, I just feel a bit embarrassed of sharing that. So it is very important for the officials who go for this house-to-house visitation to identify that even if they don't talk about it to that extent. So it's like observations and things like that. Then number 2 is to the accuracy, like the success rate. So how can I be accurate enough to support the group to escape the poverty line? So that is also really important when we talk about success. And of course, number 3 is also to talk about public satisfaction survey of the work that's done. So the way they measured the outcome is that I know they have also engaged universities to go and conduct such kind of so-called audits to make sure that there are no misuse of funds because so much fund is given towards poverty eradication, right? So you can see the misuse of funds has dropped, and also to talk about how the number of secretaries and also residents to be selected to do such work. So aside from the government themselves, there are also voluntary groups as well, like village heads and stuff like that, who are involved in this process. And it is really, and the incentive is actually very important. So if you manage the whole progression in the government is based on results and outcomes. So some of the prominent leaders that you see in China today, actually even including President Xi Jinping, they have actually successfully done quite an impressive job in uplifting economy as well as uplifting household out of poverty in order for them to be promoted within the ranks. Yeah. So the whole precision kind of performance measurement is to talk about what are the core skills, which is here. So the core is that the development of index, the household questionnaire design of survey, village survey, digital analysis, that kind of thing. And of course, there are also supporting skills as well. These are more soft skills. And fundamentally, out of it all is data and digitalization. So at the HQ level in Beijing, they really have like sort of like a digital dashboard, you can say, that would have lists or heat maps of households that are still in poverty and how it would improve over time. So that is the monitoring that is done at the HQ level, supported by realities on the ground. Of course, funding is significant in this process as well. There's been significant funding from local government as well as central government. There are also incentives from the private sectors to participate in this progress as well. But you can see that most of the funds are literally from local governments in different forms and different means. Yeah, so right now, like I said, they have changed it to the National Revitalization Bureau now that they are out of poverty in that sense. So the goal right now it is to achieve upper middle to high income country by 2035 through these 5 pillars. So poverty prevention, so preventing people to fall back, rural industry support to revitalize that, modernization of rural governance. So talking about how, let's say the village head, there's a lot of very complex kind of farmer support system, how farmer as well as land and the villages, the dynamics of it, which I'm also, I need to admit, I'm not totally 100% aware of it, but because it's quite complex. And then East and West regional assistance and also assimilation of migrated residents people with hukou system. So that is where China is leaning towards right now. Then next we look at the key messages, right? Some of the reflections that we can learn from China and what can we consider for Malaysia also is that consistent economic growth is very important as a country, because without economic growth, there will not be good enough economic opportunities or even entrepreneurial opportunities for the people as well. So that is really consistent. It has been consistently achieved since the opening up of China. Number 2 is that instead of like just having a poverty elevation kind of policy, we are moving towards more targeted strategy. So it is like, how can such policy at the national level be translated, let's say in Malaysia's context, perhaps at the state level or even at the local authorities level, to some extent, maybe household level, but probably that I'm not aware if we have achieved to that level. Perhaps there might be some NGOs who have done that, adopting a village and then just supporting that village, but not to the extent that China has done it. And actually, the last of all, is very important that to incentivize and to motivate public officials who are working on this as well through a very good monitoring system and accountability, because without that kind of accountability and monitoring, it will be challenging to incentivize people to participate and also to be actively focusing on that. So right now, and then on the right part is that yes, it is led by national direction, but it has to come at the household level, especially when we talk about the last mile of poverty eradication. So the last 3 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years in China was pretty important for China to go to a certain, quite an extreme extent in order to achieve the goal that they need. Yeah, so I would say that is pretty much a presentation or like a sharing from what China has done. Of course, happy to hear also from your side if there are any other questions and also any kind of like discussions that you would like to have. Yeah, thank you. I'm also reading the comments right now. Yeah, not remembering the roots. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, which is why it is it is quite important for targeted now. Yeah, maybe I'll just pass it back to the moderator and then maybe you can go through the questions or comments. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Miss, for the interesting sharing. Now we would like to open to the floor. Any question for the speakers from the audience? Maybe have any question you would like to ask? Or you may type your questions. We'll raise up your questions to the speakers. Okay. Okay. There got one question, Miss. the success refer to only absolute poverty or also relative poverty? Okay.
So
For the
the
case of China.
success, the declaration was absolute poverty, but right now they are also moving towards measuring multidimensional poverty, which is relative poverty. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I think Miss, one question for me. Any suggestions for Miss? Let's say now the parliament members. Okay, we know that the Prime Minister have announced that each of the parliament members they have anak angkat kampung. So is this to help to reduce the gap between the urbans and the rurals? It's based on their policies.
Yeah, I think like adopting is one thing. I think how do you implement that is also another question, right? So of course that is a good start. I think Malaysia, our kind of the kind of poverty situation that we face is quite different from China in the sense that it is not just rural poverty, which is existent in some parts of, let's say, Peninsula or even Sabah and Sarawak, especially in Sabah. At the more rural areas or even among the indigenous, we also face urban poverty as well, which is, if you notice from the China presentation, it is less talked about because it was quite focused more on rural absolute poverty. So out in Malaysia, we face two different ones. So when you talk about the anak angkat, I think to a certain extent it would work. But for Malaysia to totally eradicate poverty, especially extreme poverty for Malaysia's level, I do feel like there might be more concerted efforts that would be needed in order to achieve that. And also the cost, the issue of urban poverty will still need to be addressed, especially from Malaysia, when we talk about rising cost of living and things like that. So the whole strategy to address urban poverty might be quite different from what China has done. It would talk potentially more on the broad economic strategies, and of course the whole precision would come at the household level or even at the regional state level or even local authorities level to enhance that. So it is actually two types of poverty that we need to address for Malaysia. Yeah.
Give me further response. Okay, there another question from the floor. Okay, one of the audience asked, what are the multi-dimensional parameter that China measure?
Yeah, so just now I mentioned things like like food, medical, education. Yeah, those are multidimensional. The difference is the standard has increased. Yeah, so multidimensional means that I don't just rely on what is my household income, but it is also talking about can I have access to basic education, to healthcare, to job opportunities, things like that. So those are more multi-dimensional parameters. And I believe Malaysia is also moving towards multi-dimensional parameters when we talk about a well-being of a person. So it's not just looking at household income, but more multi-dimensional. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah. Would you agree that politics is the key to their success? If so, what the role did local level CCP represent play, and how Malaysia MP and ADUNS get involved? Okay, Miss, what is your opinion based on this?
Actually, I think that is a good question. So I believe political will is very important, and there needs to be also incentive as well. So the way China has also the role that the CCP reps. So basically CCP reps, a lot of them are actually in the government, right? Because there's only just one party system. So they are incentivized. Their promotion is based on the results and outcomes at the area that they are governing. So so some people you can see accelerated promotion based on what they have achieved within, let's say, the district or even the provinces. Whereas in Malaysia, how can our MPs as well as others be involved? I believe actually we like when we read on the news, you would see or read things like that, right? But I'm not sure if it is concerted enough. So which means that we need a broad-based policy probably at the national level, which means at the government level. And also then we can also engage MPs as well as others working on it. So one of the states that I've worked with before, they also look into social well-being or even livability. So the way they are organized is that they have a broad based programs. So things like, providing free healthcare subsidies and things like that to that area. And then the MP would, one of the MP who hold, one of the EXCOs who hold the portfolio would oversee the program and to make sure that they are implementing that well. So that is more at the state government level. So that one is more from EXCOs that have been selected with that portfolio. So I believe that our local MPs would also go and work with the local communities, but perhaps what can be improved is more like the outcomes. Yeah, what is really lacking? From what I observe is that the outcomes are not really measured. So, for example, even when we have all these programs like autism penyayang, we have got other different types of programs. To what extent they have impacted the communities? To what extent it has also impacted, let's say, the state's poverty level, or even the outcomes of the state that we want to see. They are not really measured well. Because they're not measured well, it is hard to incentivize the people to be involved into it. So which is why the outcomes has to be really clear. Instead of just giving like a cash handout or a relief system, it is also important to understand what are the outcomes, broad-based, as well as to incentivize them as well. So that would be needed, I believe, to support our MPs or even adults to be involved in this level. So the kind of outcomes and policies would have to be developed by government for sure.
Yeah, another question is,
Yeah.
okay, the audience asks, our district officers should be tasked with the poverty eradication KPI. Do you agree with it?
I think so. Yeah, I believe we should. Otherwise, we would always not achieve that kind of the first goal, SDG 1. So yeah, we should have that kind of KPIs. Yeah, even for the government also.
Any other question from the floor? Okay, while waiting is another question for me. Okay, let's see. Now we see some of the people, they are in poverty. Okay, but sometimes they may have opportunity to get income, to earn some money, to left or to upgrade themselves, but some of them, they refuse. Okay, what do you think about the mindset of some of these people that they want to stay in the level of poverty? Maybe in poverty, they get some benefit from the government or some relief. Yeah. How do you think about it, Miss?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question again?
Okay, mindset, mention about mindset lah. Some of the people, they prefer to stay in poverty level. Let's say they low income, the government will give some benefit or helping them. So they refuse to get out for jobs like that.
Yeah, it is true. Even in Malaysia, it also happened. I know one of the state whom I talked to is that the way cash relief was handed out was that, let's say 3,000 ringgit, if let's say per household, yeah, okay, 3,000 is a bit too high. Let's say it's actually only just 1,500.
Yeah.
So people who so 1,500, you will be able to get let's say a support of, let's say 300 ringgit every month. So households, they would try to maintain at 1,400 of household income, because then they will qualify for the 300, whereas household, they are living at 1,600, they don't qualify for that. So that is where the kind of system is also a bit biased, which also happens in China as well. Who are the poor and who are the rich? So what is interesting in China, what they have done is that as part of the identification process of who are the poor, it is not just the officers, they also rely on their neighbors and villagers to tell them who are the poor. So probably you can see it as a registry or like a list of the poor. It can be contested by their neighbors or the households or the community if they are really poor or not, because maybe they declare on taxation that they are poor, but they actually live lavishly. So there's such kind of system. I'm not really sure if that would work in Malaysia's context, because I don't think we are such a communist country in that sense. So whereas over here in Malaysia, I think the identification process would be really critical in this sense. And also to make sure that the system or like the support that we're giving, it is not just subsidies or handouts, because there is only a limited amount of grant that the government can give year on year to support all these social programs. And the beneficiaries would be impacted by the amount of grants, which is why it needs to also have the broad-based type of economic goal in order to address that as well. So it is quite a complex system. Yeah, I think that's that.
Okay. Thank you, Miss, for the response.
Yeah.
Okay, the clock is almost 3.
Yeah.
I understand that Miss is rushing to airport. Okay, so I open to the floor. Any last question from the floor? Anyone? Okay. I think that there are no other questions. Thank you, Miss, for the interesting sharing today. Okay, before we end our session, can everyone, all the participants,